welcome to our deep dive into the word iconoclast.
Ooh, that's a good one.
It's a word that might sound a little intimidating at first.
Yeah, it does a little bit, right?
Well, we're going to break it down, look at its definition, explore its origins, and, just see how it's used today.
I think it'll be fun. So let's start with the basics.
Right.
So the Merriam-Webster dictionary defines an iconoclast in a couple of ways.
Okay.
The first one is someone who attacks cherished beliefs or institutions.
So interesting.
And then the other definition is someone who destroys religious images or opposes their veneration.
So like not just disagreeing with something, but kind of like actively challenging it or even dismantling it.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's where the Greek origin of the word really comes in.
Okay.
So iconoclastos literally means image destroyer.
Wow.
Which comes from icono for image, and then konoklastos, which means breaker or destroyer.
So the word itself has a pretty, powerful image, to it. I guess you could say the word itself is kind of iconoclastic, breaking down the very idea of what a word can be.
Ooh, I like that.
And speaking of breaking things down, the first recorded use of the word iconoclast in English was in 1641.
Mm-hmm.
And is specifically referring to the destruction of religious images.
Right.
It seems like a word that perfectly captures those moments in history where people dare to, question the status quo, sometimes quite literally with hammers and chisels.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, think about William Dowsing during the Protestant Reformation,
Right.
destroying all those religious sites across England, or even the defacement of Roman statues during the rise of Christianity.
Oh, yeah.
These were just huge periods of immense cultural and religious change.
Yeah.
And iconoclast was the perfect word to describe the people who were actively shaping that change.
It's almost like a physical manifestation of a shifting worldview, right?
Exactly.
As the word evolved, its meaning expanded beyond just those like physical acts of destruction. So when we talk about iconoclasts today, we're not necessarily talking about people smashing statues.
No, necessarily, no.
So how's the word changed?
Well, today, iconoclast is often used to describe someone who challenges conventions, disrupts industries, or pushes boundaries in their field.
Like a Bob Dylan in music or a Steve Jobs in technology.
Exactly. They might not be physically breaking anything.
Right.
But their ideas and their actions, they challenge the established order and kind of force us to rethink the way things are done.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So we've gone from literal image breakers to those who break down conventional thinking.
Exactly. And the word iconoclast has managed to capture both of those things.
Right.
Which is pretty amazing when you think about it.
It is a reminder that challenging the status quo can take so many different forms, from the physical to the intellectual.
Absolutely.
And speaking of challenging the status quo, one of the most striking examples that we found in our research was the Cultural Revolution in China.
Oh, yes.
I mean, the destruction there was on a massive scale.
It
targeted anything that was seen as representing the four olds.
Right.
Old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits.
It's hard to even imagine the scale of the destruction.
It is.
It really highlights the power of that word, iconoclast.
Yeah.
And the impact it can have on history and on culture.
Absolutely. And then this leads us to another example, the Gandhavapi Mosque in India, which stands on what was once the site of a Hindu temple.
Right.
Which raises some really complex questions about iconoclasm and cultural identity and also like the rewriting of history.
Definitely a lot to unpack there.
So again, we see this clash between preserving the past and also forging a new path with this word iconoclast right at the heart of the debate.
Right in the center of it.
And speaking of complexities, you mentioned that the word has evolved over time. So what are some of the ways that we see iconoclast being used in conversations today?
Well, that's an interesting question because, it's a word with such a dramatic past rooted in physical destruction. But nowadays we don't really associate iconoclasts with, smashing things, do we? Not really. Yeah. So how do we use it today? What comes to mind when you hear someone described as an iconoclast?
Yeah, like what does that even mean anymore?
Well, let's think about someone like Elon Musk for a second.
Okay.
He's a great example of a modern-day iconoclast, I think.
In what way?
Well, he's disrupting like all these different industries with these unconventional ideas and these bold ventures.
Yeah. And he doesn't seem to care who he upsets.
Exactly. Like he's not literally tearing down statues or anything.
Yeah.
But he's challenging the way we think about things like space travel, electric vehicles, even social media.
So it's more about a mindset then.
It is.
A willingness to kind of shake things up and challenge the status quo, even if it ruffles a few feathers.
Yeah, and it's not always about these huge gestures or like revolutionizing entire industries.
Okay.
You can be an iconoclast in your own specific field, challenging traditional ways of thinking and doing things.
So you could be an iconoclastic teacher or artist, or even a chef.
Absolutely.
Interesting.
It's really all about pushing those boundaries and questioning assumptions no matter what you do.
I like that.
And that brings us to a really fascinating concept, the iconoclastic brain.
Ooh, okay, now that sounds intriguing. What is an iconoclastic brain?
So a neuroscientist named Gregory Burns,
Okay.
he explores this idea in his book called Iconoclast.
Hmm.
And he suggests that the brains of these iconoclasts, they're actually wired a little bit differently,
Right.
which allows them to see the world and respond to challenges in these really unique ways.
So there's actually a biological basis for this tendency to challenge the norm.
It seems that way.
Wow, so what are these differences?
Well, he identifies 3 key areas where iconoclasts' brains differ:
Okay.
perception,
Okay.
fear response,
Mm-hmm.
and social intelligence.
Let's break those down one by one.
All right.
Starting with perception, what makes their perception so different?
Well, they tend to perceive things differently
Okay.
because their brains don't really fall into the same efficiency traps that most of us do.
Okay.
So they're always looking for new patterns and connections,
Mm-hmm.
and they're always challenging their own assumptions and those of other people.
So they're not just accepting things at face value.
Exactly. They see opportunities where other people see obstacles,
Right.
and they're not afraid to challenge what everyone else thinks is true.
So they're wired to question the status quo, even if it's something that everyone else takes for granted.
Mm-hmm. And they're always looking for a better way to do things.
Okay, so that's perception.
Okay.
What about fear response?
Right. Well, for most people, novelty and the unknown trigger a fear response in the brain.
Yeah, we're wired to avoid uncertainty.
Exactly. And we like to stick with what's familiar, but
Yeah.
iconoclasts seem to have a different relationship with fear.
Interesting.
They don't shy away from these new experiences. They kind of embrace them.
Hmm.
And they even seem to thrive on pushing their own boundaries and stepping outside their comfort zones.
So it's not that they don't experience fear, it's just that they don't let it control them.
Exactly.
They see the potential in the unknown rather than just focusing on the risk.
Mm-hmm. It's like they've somehow managed to rewire their brains to see the unknown as exciting rather than threatening.
That's fascinating. And what about this third difference, social intelligence?
Okay, well, iconoclasts aren't just these like lone wolves working in isolation.
Right.
They're often really skilled communicators and collaborators.
So they have to be able to get other people on board.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They have to understand how to navigate these social networks,
Mhm.
build relationships,
Okay.
and really persuade other people to see the value in their ideas.
They can take their unconventional thinking and
Yeah.
translate it into real results.
Right. And they can articulate their vision in a way that inspires and motivates other people,
Hmm.
which often ends up sparking, movements or even revolutions.
Right. So it sounds like becoming a successful iconoclast requires this special blend of all 3 of these traits.
Yes, it does.
Perception, fear response, and social intelligence.
Yeah, you really have to have all 3.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, and Burns makes it clear in his book that true iconoclasm is actually pretty rare.
That makes sense.
It takes this really unique combination of traits and experiences to consistently challenge the norm and then actually make a lasting impact on the world.
Wow. So we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
From literally smashing statues to the inner workings of the iconoclastic brain.
Uh-huh.
We've explored the origins of the word, its evolution, how it's used in conversations today.
Yeah, it's been quite the journey.
It has, and it seems like the word iconoclast itself has undergone a bit of an iconoclastic journey,
I think so.
breaking free from that literal meaning and becoming something much broader and more nuanced.
Absolutely. But as with any deep dive, I think we've only just scratched the surface.
That's true. There's always more to uncover.
Oh,
And in our final segment, we're going to explore some of the thought-provoking questions and ethical considerations that come up when we think about iconoclasm a little bit deeper. Okay, so we've explored like the who, what, and how of, iconoclast.
we have.
But now let's get into what
Yeah.
are the implications of actually like challenging the status quo? Is it always a good thing?
Well, that's a really great question. And I think it's important to remember that iconoclasm, by its very nature, is disruptive.
Right.
And disruption can have both positive and negative consequences.
That's like that saying, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs, right?
Exactly.
But sometimes those eggs represent, traditions or beliefs
Hmm.
or even like whole systems that people really care about.
Yeah, and that's where things get really complex.
Yeah. How do we balance this need for progress and change with respect for what came before?
It's hard.
How do we know the difference between iconoclasm that actually leads to positive change
Right.
and iconoclasm that just causes harm?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is a tricky balance.
It is.
And it doesn't seem like there's an easy answer.
No.
So where do we even begin to unravel all of that?
Well, I think one really crucial thing to think about is intent.
Okay.
Like, what is the intent behind this iconoclastic act?
Okay.
Is this person genuinely trying to make a positive change?
Mm-hmm.
Or are they driven by ego or self-interest?
So
Or even just a desire to destroy?
motives really do matter.
They do.
But I imagine that those motives can sometimes be really hard to figure out.
They can be. And, history is full of examples of iconoclasm being used for both, noble purposes and then also very destructive purposes.
Yeah.
Like if we go back to the Cultural Revolution,
Okay.
while there was this desire to break free from the past
Ah.
and to create a more, equal society,
Yeah.
this widespread destruction of all these cultural artifacts and even persecution of people who held traditional beliefs had just devastating consequences.
Right.
It's a stark reminder that good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes.
Yeah. It shows that iconoclasm, when it's taken to extremes or used for, bad reasons, can lead to the loss of really valuable knowledge, traditions, and even human lives.
It's true. But on the other hand, when iconoclasm is driven by a genuine desire to improve society or to fight injustice, it can be a really powerful force for good.
Oh, I see, like the civil rights movement in the U.S.,
Exactly.
where activists challenged these deeply ingrained racial prejudices and led to these really significant, legal and social changes.
Yeah, they were fighting against a system that was really fundamentally flawed,
Right.
and they were willing to challenge it even when it meant putting themselves at risk, and that helped to create a better future.
So it seems like there's this whole spectrum of iconoclasm, right?
There is.
From the destructive to the revolutionary.
Mhm.
And I guess it's up to us to kind of critically examine each case,
Yes.
considering the motives and the methods and also the potential consequences.
You've got it. Iconoclasm is a really complex concept that requires us to think carefully and with nuance.
Yeah, we can't just label all iconoclasts as heroes or villains.
Right. Right. We need to really engage with their ideas, their actions.
Yeah.
And we need to think about the historical and social context.
It's a reminder that progress can come at a cost,
It can.
and we need to really think about what that cost is.
Yeah, we do.
Blindly following or rejecting any ideology can lead to, unintended consequences.
Potentially harmful ones.
Exactly. And speaking of different perspectives, that article from Retrospect Journal really got me thinking
Oh, yeah.
with that question. Is iconoclasm the destruction of history or the definition of it?
That's a really good question because in a way it's kind of both, isn't it?
It is. It destroys those old structures and ways of thinking, but then that creates space for something new to emerge.
Right. It's this constant cycle of creation and destruction that pushes us forward.
For better or for worse.
Exactly. For better or for worse.
It really makes you think about the role that we each play
It does.
in shaping the world around us. Are we upholding the status quo or are we challenging it?
Yeah. And if we are challenging it, are we doing it in a way that's constructive?
Right. Are we making things better?
Big questions to think about.
Yeah, those are questions worth pondering.
Definitely.
And I think on that note, we'll leave you to contemplate the complexities of, iconoclasts.
Keep your ears open.
Yeah.
And you might just spot a few iconoclasts out there shaking things up and making the world a little bit more interesting.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been fun.
We hope you learned something new and are feeling inspired to maybe challenge a few assumptions of your own.